欢迎来到分论坛，英国教育信息化2.0利弊和机遇。有请嘉宾上台。Welcome to the Britain and Education Informatization 2.0, the good, the bad, and the opportunity subforum. Let's welcome our speakers onto the stage.
A warm welcome to the UK Subforum on Education Informatization. I know that my panelists and I are delighted that you could join us today, so thank you for your attending. And as a point of order, we would also like to extend our gratitude to Ms. Qiuyan for organizing the panel today, and for Mr. Thomas Cheng from ZHAO for inviting us and for their kind and warm hospitality, so thank you. I'd like to first start by introducing our panelists. So first we have Ms. Dawn Hallibone.
Thank you. So my background is that I taught for 24 years in the primary sector, and I now work as a consultant for Too Simple Software.
Ms. Emma Rogers.
Hello. So my background also is in education. Many years ago I was a teacher. Then I moved into children's publishing, so trade publishing with picture books and those kind of things, both as an author and an illustrator. And now I'm the CEO of an online platform called Little Bridge.
Mr. Jim Kell.
各位来宾，下午好。我非常荣幸有这个机会，参加这个会议。I'm Director of International Partnerships for UCL Education, which is the largest provider of formative and diagnostic assessments for schools, with about more than 50% of schools in the UK using these. We've made a firm commitment to enriching education in China and are now working in partnership with a Shanghai-based school improvement company called General Plan Munko Education Group to deliver resources to Chinese state schools, and they're called Fanglie Zhaoyu Jituan. Thank you.
And Mr. Leroy Horde.
Hi, my name is Leroy, and I'm the General Manager for Asia for TES, so formerly the Times Educational Supplement. So we work to attract, train, and empower educators around the world.
So now that we've introduced our panelists, I think it's important that we set the agenda of why we are here today and what the British experience has to inform the Chinese experience of education technology. In 2018, the Financial Times called on the leading nations in educational technology to create a body akin to the G7 or the G20, and organizations such as the EdTech 7, where leading nations and policymakers could come together to discuss the latest reforms to education policy. As we look towards the horizon of 2030 and the OECD's report on the future of education, it's therefore important that we share our experiences. As the recent reforms to the OECD's PISA tests have shown, education can no longer be a question of a factory emulation of testing assessments. But that leaves us with the question of how should we measure the success of education? In the spirit of the Financial Times' call for a G7 or an EdTech 7 of international educators to share best practices, we are here with you to share the UK's experience with education informatization. We do so in the belief that the UK experience is of uppermost relevance to China. Why do I say that? Well, the first reason I say that is because our chronologies and our timelines of adoption of educational technology are nearly one and the same. The first educational technology was used in Chinese schools in 1922 in the form of Chinese radios. Similarly, the first educational technology was used in UK schools in 1923. And fast forward nearly a century later, and we are now the two nations in the world who have adopted an education informatization 2.0 plan. In April 2018, China adopted its education informatization 2.0 action plan. And it was exactly 12 months later, in April 2019, that Britain also adopted an education informatization 2.0 plan. The second reason is that we are both global leaders of EdTech. If China is clearly the global leader across the world, the UK is the global leader in Europe. As the Financial Times reported in May, of the 20 fastest growing companies in Europe who are in the EdTech sector, half are based in London. We have 1,200 EdTech companies in London, of which 67 have been rated as world-class by the OECD. Furthermore, as our panelists departed from Beijing to London, they transferred between cities that are global hubs of EdTech. Behind Beijing, London has the highest concentration of EdTech companies per capita in the world. For every million people who live in London, there are 77 EdTech companies, which comes only behind Beijing, which has 120 EdTech companies per million people. So the key questions we want to look at today are what our shared experiences can show us. And to do so, I'd first like to look at the key themes that have emerged during Education Informatization 2.0 so that we can identify them and open up a panel discussion. Dawn, you were a member of the UK government's Educational Technology Action Group, which was the advisory body whose recommendations eventually led to the outcome of the adoption of the Education Informatization 2.0 plan in Britain. But before we talk about Education Informatization 2.0, I was wondering if first you could walk us through what Education Informatization 1.0 was and how its objectives differed from that of 2.0.
Yeah, so the Educational Technology Action Group was set up with teachers and chaired by Professor Stephen Heppel, and looked at where education was in the UK. And it had centred on the technology, so putting the hardware into schools, making sure the infrastructure was there. But actually, a lot of the content was just digitising the textbooks and putting that out, as opposed to actually reforming education technology. So the group was tasked with then looking at how we move that on, as opposed to just parachuting more devices into schools and giving them the hardware without actually underpinning teachers' pedagogy and helping them understand how to make the best use of the technology moving forward.
So if I get a sense, what you're saying is that with education technology, there was more a focus on the technology rather than the education.
Exactly that, and making sure that the CPD for the teachers underlined that, so they saw the reason why they should use technology in the classroom for the advancement of the pupil education.
And Emma, I want to ask you a question now. One of the senses I get from Dawn's comment there about the first stage of education informatization, really just about being reproducing traditional methods of teaching or classroom resources such as print textbooks on the internet, is that we used educational technology just to mirror existing forms rather than using it as sort of having any transformational potential or value added to learning. I wanted to ask you, how do you think Education Informatization 2.0 differs from its previous stage with regards to the role that academic research plays with regard to product design?
Okay, so as I said, Little Bridge is an online platform.
I think you need to
Yes.
hold it slightly down.
Sorry, and as an online platform, we are changing the way that children learn English, and the link between technology and the outcome very much is what we're focused on, because technology is enabling us to deliver to more people, more affordably, so more people have access, but it's also enabling us to change the way traditional learning happens. So to that extent, I think the new way of looking at tech is the most exciting way and the most interesting way, because it is giving everybody the possibility to think again about what they're trying to do. So to give a specific example, with teaching English in the way that we're doing, which is connecting children and organising the personal training for children to learn English around how they want to connect with another child around the world through the medium of English is only possible because we're doing it with technology, and traditional methods wouldn't allow this. At the same time, we're able to make sure that we can enable every child to be aligned with the kind of international standards that then feeds into more traditional testing. So it's a bridge, basically.
And the thing that struck me about your answer there was your sort of emphasis on this idea about traditional methods and how there was this sort of rigid adherence to that. One thing I'm interested to ask Jim is specifically with regard to what I think could potentially be a second defining characteristic of education informatization 2.0. And that is, we've seen in recent years in both the UK and China perhaps a desire to make a slight shift away from the traditional PISA form of examinations. And I think parents in both countries want to see their children learn more than just the traditional core subjects of reading, science, and maths. They want their children to be able to explore other subjects in their creativity. I was going to ask you, Jim, what do you think is the role of sort of a more child-centered focus to learning under education informatization 2.0?
I think if you look at the wider context of education and just put technology aside just for a moment, I'm sure we've got a lot of parents in the room. If you think of your child, you know, how much do you want them to just meet certain benchmarks and certain requirements, or how much do you want them to develop as their own person with their own creativity and their own thinking, and for them to make the academic journey which suits them? And I think, as Dawn said earlier, you know, we were so excited about the technology early on that we may have forgotten that actually it's all about helping each child to be the best that they can be, and for us to understand what the needs of each child is and to make the technology work for them. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And if we're talking about technology that sort of works for them, the idea of technology that works is something that's obviously of key importance in education informatization 2.0. I think in the UK we've had this expression which is cupboards of shame, and that describes schools that have these lockers or drawers that are full of hardware products that haven't been used because teachers haven't been given the digital training they need to integrate these products successfully into the classroom. And this brings me on to you, Leroy. Obviously, any part of a new EdTech strategy has to integrate the role of teachers. And we know from sort of OECD figures that if it's been recommended that for every $1 spent on hardware, we spend 30 cents on teacher training, historically we've only spent about 10 cents in every $1 on teacher training. How do you think this second stage of EdTech differs with regards to the emphasis it places on teachers, and what is TES Global doing to further that?
It's incredibly important. There's been so much investment in education, but you're right, the investment in the teachers and empowering them has somewhat been left behind. So we did a survey with the Council of British International Schools last year, and 94% of head teachers at leading British independent schools indicated that continuous professional development is extremely important in integrating technology and improving learning outcomes. But on the other end, in the same survey, a third of them admitted that they're doing no professional development whatsoever. So we're seeing a disconnect. However, schools are continuing to approach us. We've developed a learning platform by which we're able to deliver online learning at a flexible pace for teachers around the world. So it is helping to bridge that gap because these are some of the most well-resourced schools globally, and they still struggle to provide adequate training. So I think it's on everyone's mind, certainly, and it's a big part of the 2.0 strategy. If we are to really continue to implement EdTech in a way that it's meant to be, we have to empower teachers.
Thank you. I think now that we've sort of outlined each of those sort of core areas, the last one, of course, being the fragmented nature of the school system. What do I mean by the fragmented nature of the school system? Well, I think in the UK and China, we face problems that all nations face, and that's that we have complex school systems. According to the OECD, the UK has the second most complicated school system in the world, coming second only after Chile. We have 24,000 different schools with different types of school structure. And I think also China, just like any other country, also faces challenges with regards to the nature of its school system. We've seen with regards to the urban-rural divide in China and the implementation of EdTech that there's an imbalance. So I think the last key aim that we'd like to discuss as part of this panel is on the nature of the school system itself and how EdTech can help to manage and overcome those difficulties. I'd first like, therefore, to turn to the first subject that we identified, which is marrying academic research and product design. Emma, if I may begin with you, you mentioned briefly in your previous answer that sort of obviously educational technology had primarily been used to simply replicate digitized textbooks online. What role do you think that EdTech can play in disrupt traditional methods of learning, and what is the value added of doing so?
Okay, well, in terms of disruption, I mean, I think technology is really the key. It is the traditional classroom, which tends to be a very sort of solitary, isolated place. Those walls can be broken down with technology, and teachers can be encouraged to think about all the multitude of technology tools that they can bring into their classroom and to use to, if you like, be a window on the world for the children that they're teaching. So I think that there is an enormous opportunity to disrupt with technology, but as you said, I think it's very important that those of us who are bringing disruptive technologies in the classroom are doing it with a very strong research-backed academic basis to do that. In other words, I think this is not about novelty or doing different things for the sake of doing them. It's with a sense that there is a real piece of academic research behind the solution that you're providing.
Yeah, and I'd like to follow up on that with you, actually. What you just mentioned about a window of the world, the attendees here have probably seen that there's been quite a few UNESCO ITE events of their international technology in education sector, and one of their key themes is opening a window of the world by allowing communication between students in China and Russia, China and the UK. And they've also performed a lot of academic research which validates how programs such as Little Bridges in encouraging communication between students across the world really helps improve language acquisition. But I know that with regard to you and in the UK, we've worked with University College London to put 260 education technology companies through a program that helps them integrate the latest academic research into their products. What's your experience working with the UCL program?
Well, first of all, I should say very positive experience and a real breath of fresh air into a commercial company like Little Bridge. The program with UCL Educate basically gives or gave my team an opportunity to do really intensive training on research methodology. And we already would have claimed, I think, legitimately that we use design thinking in our product development, but this brought in an extra sort of layer of academic rigor. it helped us look at the broad spread of existing research on educational technology, but it also allowed us to develop our own particular research question using millions of lines of data that we already had to ask a very important question. And for us, it was, is there a very strong connection between social engagement and improvements in learning outcomes in terms of English language learning? And that was the main benefit we had. So we got the generalized introduction to educational technology, the very intensive introduction to research methodology, and then the opportunity to do our own piece of research.
So I think this is relevant not only to UK but to the Chinese context, because in 2015 in education technology, I mean, the reason we have these whole monikers about education technology 2.0 and such a clear desire to differentiate it from what came before is because in 2015 we had the OECD's Students, Computers and Learning report, which famously showed that just having computers in schools didn't actually improve educational outcomes. And so I think for teachers there's been maybe a fear that education technology is just marketing or PR and that this doesn't actually lead to an improvement in educational outcomes. And Jim, I wanted to talk to you about how this applies to the Chinese context, because I know that GL Assessment does a lot of work in China. We know from figures published by Beijing Normal University that 77% of teachers in China now want to see research into edtech products before they consider trialing a product. And there are 4.2 million Chinese teachers who are producing their own research on edtech. How important a role would you suggest that edtech companies attribute to academic research? And most importantly for the Chinese market, how important is it that this research is localized to the Chinese context?
Okay, it's a really big question, but it hits the absolute heart of how China and the UK have been collaborating and can collaborate, and the level of research. Obviously, if it takes you 10 years to do the research, then the idea, the product will have disappeared after 10 years or run out of date. If it takes you a month, it's probably not going to be rigorous enough. So there is a kind of balance, I think, in this. As I mentioned earlier, we're working with our partner, Fangliu Zhaoyu Zhijun in Shanghai, using a cognitive abilities test, CAT4, which is very, very popular around the world. And together with the China National Institute of Education Sciences, Future School Labs, we collaborated over 18 months to trial and localize CAT4 using 15,000 students in 19 provinces, 30% rural areas. That's quite a high level of rigor. And now with our partner, when we are promoting CAT4 in Chinese government schools, that is the question. How do you know it works? And what level of rigor have you put to it? And obviously assessment it needs to be really, really rigorous. But also we need to know that it actually works for Chinese children. There is a practical issue here as well. Does it actually work in Chinese schools? So it took 18 months. We partnered with a very prestigious Chinese high-level organization. And we also had the project evaluated by experts from the University of Nanjing and the University of Oxford. So we felt, in localizing, both parties needed to collaborate. It wasn't just the UK side doing the work. We brought our expertise to the project. The Chinese side brought their expertise. And therefore, it's truly localized. But actually, the product is still an international product. So we believe we have the sort of ideal world where the assessment remains international, but there is a localized version which we know works and which has been evaluated. So I think it's a balance of getting the rigor right and getting the local support.
Yeah. And I think as part of sort of the status anxiety of education technology, we often we often look towards universities to provide us with some kind of accreditation of that we're successful products, and I think that is entirely legitimate. I'm also interested, however, that in China we have this phenomenon, which I think we're also seeing in the UK, of Chinese teachers producing research as to EdTech products efficiency. We were saying that 4.2 million Chinese teachers are currently publishing their research online as to EdTech. And I wanted to ask you, Leroy, how important do you think it is that when we're designing educational technology products, that instead of just maybe taking sort of academia and academics input into the process, that we also look towards including schools and teachers in the process?
It has to be a part of it from the beginning, because there's so many times where an edtech company will come up with a premise that they believe is great. It could have even started with academic research. They pat themselves on the back, roll out the product, and then no one can use it because it's not fit for purpose. So one of the things that we've done to combat this is we've actually transformed the way our product teams work. So we don't just have engineers and product managers on those teams. We also have some of our content people that work with schools. We have marketing people. And then we actually go out to schools very, very early on in the process. So they're with us as we are coming up with the concept initially. They're a part of that process. They go all the way through then to beta trials. So I think if you're not looking at everything, both top-down from an academic research standpoint, but also bottom-up and thinking about what learning objectives are you trying to achieve, and then having that as a part of the initial design and problem-solving statement. That's the way you have to do product development in 2019 if you're going to meet these objectives.
I think I'd like to move on to our second subject now, which is about really trying to embrace what people are calling a whole child approach to education technology. Now, as I mentioned, we've seen in we've definitely seen in China at the very least, that when in 2012 PISA reported that Shanghai had finished first in reading, first in science, and first in mathematics, many nations across the world jumped and thought, oh, we must copy and replicate all the Chinese approach to learning. But we know from Professors Xia and Hui Li from Beijing Normal University, who have done a survey of Chinese parents in Shenzhen, that actually a lot of Chinese parents have interpreted these PISA results as actually quite a worrying development, that they want their children not simply to be the product of an exam-based system, but also want to have the opportunity to develop their own skills and unique talents. And you might not be able to see it in the graph behind us, but the key bridge for this subject is really that in both the UK and China, our students work about 7 hours more per week than the OECD average on subjects such as reading, science, and maths, giving them far less time to study creative subjects. So Dawn, I wanted to turn to you to ask about this sort of new approach in the EdTech. You're Too Simple, obviously you're selling to primary schools in 74 countries. There's 2 million learners who access your platforms. But you've long pioneered the idea that a curriculum should be based around creativity. And I think this is a vastly different philosophy than seen in many other EdTech products. And I wanted to see if you could explain the rationale behind it.
Yeah, Too Simple was formed 20 years ago with the basis that creativity can inspire learning, but also raise standards. And if you look at Mitch Resnick's The Lifelong Kindergarten about collaboration and creativity, inspiring learning, but also Ken Robinson, who said that creativity is a process of having original ideas that have value, and that creativity is putting your imagination to work. So our products look at children being able to use their creativity through perhaps traditional subjects, but where they can express their creativity and collaborate together, either on the same piece of work or individually, and use those ideas both at home and at school across all subjects.
Yeah, and I think if something that's just come to mind when you said that is a lot of people talk about Kidzania, which is this international, it's like an international playground where children can try out different jobs. And this is, part of it is to encourage students to think as though they're a scientist, to think as though they are a teacher, to think as though they are a firefighter. And the research that you've mentioned, I think it shows that when children think like a scientist rather than just sort of repeat what they're told out of a textbook, that they actually learn a lot quicker. So I was going to ask you what sort of role you think this plays in Too Simple's education platform.
It plays a vast role. It's what is at the heart of all the Too Simple projects, because I think you can't necessarily undermine what creativity is. It's really hard to sort of teach creativity as a subject. It's about learning in different guises and taking on different roles. It's about failing and then learning from your mistakes, and also collaborating and learning from each other as well.
And Jim, something I also wanted to turn to you to ask is, we've been talking about the whole child approach to learning, but I think what your research from GL assessment shows is that perhaps we also need to think about the whole classroom approach to learning. And that's the idea that in a classroom we have many different profiles of student. We have in England an expression which is called the forgotten half, which refers to the fact that we often overlook the half of our students who are maybe better at vocational subjects, who are better at spatial reasoning than verbal reasoning, perhaps. And I was wondering how, in your opinion, educational technology can be used to unlock the skills of all learners of different profiles, of the whole classroom.
Okay, we did a study using our CAT4 assessment, which showed that the UK is actually missing about 30,000 little Einsteins every year. Okay, maybe there wouldn't be Einsteins, but certainly extremely good scientists. We're actually missing those children. We are not revealing the talent. And so if we're going to address learning and we're going to address teaching to help children, as I mentioned earlier on about, understanding and treating every child differently, which is really difficult, isn't it, if you're a teacher, to treat every child differently. If we're going to make an effort to do that, we do need to reveal their true talent. We need to have a way to look inside their brains and look inside their hearts. And these are two things which generally aren't assessed. We tend to assess, whether they can do maths, science, Chinese, English, and that's how we judge, our children as individuals. But surely we're forgetting that children think differently and they feel differently. And so that's why we've specialized in assessments. And the important thing about those assessments is that they need to be digital, they need to be able to reach a very wide number of children, and they need to be able to provide results to teachers and parents quickly. And that's where the role of technology for us works in assessment, to discover these forgotten children, to make sure that that child at the back of the class who's asleep quite a lot, actually there is talent there, and the teacher needs to know about it and the parent needs to know about it. And it will be different from the child sitting next to them. And then the next step, of course, is how you train the learners and the teachers to deal with their own profiles.
Thank you. I think the next subject I want to bring us on to is also related to the OECD's PISA tests, and that's the question of reducing workload and improving well-being. We all know that our country's respective teachers are the key institutions of our education system. We rely on them tremendously. And you may not be able to see all of this graphic, so I'll say it for you. The OECD report has shown that our teachers are literally drowning in workload. They work on average, both in China and the UK, 5 hours more than their counterparts in other countries. And so I was thinking to myself, when print textbooks first came into schools, it was shown in a study by the UK Publisher Association that they saved teachers 11 minutes per day. A quality textbook could save them 11 minutes per day. So I wanted to ask you, Dawn, if when we went to print textbooks, we saved 11 minutes per day, when we go to educational technology, how can digitizing products help us to save and reduce workload?
I think it can be helped enormously because at the heart of it, what we want to enable teachers to do is teach. And I think technology can help them in a number of ways. Reporting and assessment and being able to give children instant feedback and building on what they've done in the class to help them next, not sitting hand marking and writing lots of feedback. Technology can help us in giving teachers the data that they need to move the learning on almost instantly and give it to them in reports that they can understand and help them plan for the next lessons. So to break down those more time-consuming tasks, I believe that that's where technology can help. However, teachers need to be trained into how to make the most effective use of technology, because where it will fall down is if you say to a teacher, this technology will help you, and they might be thinking, well, that's going to add to my workload because it's going to take me so long to learn how to use it. So we have to have the educational technology to help, going hand in hand with what Leroy and Jim said earlier about the CPD, in training teachers to ensure that what they're using has real impact for them on their job and ultimately the children that they're teaching.
Yeah, I'm going to return to Leroy and Emma in a second, but you just mentioned the word data, and that sparked something in my mind. Obviously, there's a whole debate about the role that data should play in reducing teacher workload, and the fear is, in I think many countries, is that too much data can lead to teachers having too much work because they're having to collect it all the time, but also appreciating that there's a balance and that data can really help form insights into which areas students need help with. I want to ask you, Jim, what role do you think educational technology can play in terms of, well, at least what balance do you think needs to be struck with the collection of data, and how should data be used by schools when looking at students?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, in some cases, schools don't get the choice that they want in terms of what data they're asked to provide. So it's a difficult, it's a dilemma for schools. I think they are demanding the sort of data that they want. And I don't know about China so much, but certainly in the UK, I think teachers often feel that they're being asked to go through processes to get data, which they can't actually use to further the child's development. So ideally, maybe we can do this together with China. Ideally, it is about, you know, what kind of assessments that you decide you really need, but what are you going to do with that data afterwards? I think a bit like with the change from the first stage to the second stage of technology, people get very excited about data. Oh, we just need lots of it, and then everything will be okay. Well, in fact, it won't be okay because you'll be drowned in the data, and teachers' workloads will increase, but they'll also lose their motivation too if they're drowned in data. So we're very strict about data. Our job is to make teachers' lives easier by providing them with data which helps them to understand the child better and to waste less time doing things that they don't need to do. Obviously, as my colleagues here have said, you know, the practicalities of having digital data have just changed things hugely. If you think of, you know, the marking that you had to do before we had this technology, and if you think of, you know, people in some places are still messing around with spreadsheets to produce their data, well, that's really not necessary anymore. The data can actually work for itself. So I think we need to be very strict about what data, but it's our job as providers to make that data work in ways that teachers can just get on with what they're good at, which is providing a good education for these children.
I want to turn to you now, Emma, that I think there's an increasing idea as well that when we're looking at how teachers save time, we've often focused on simply the classroom. But in the UK and a lot of international markets now, I think you referred earlier to this concept of a golden triangle, that there's three stakeholders in school. There's the teachers, the students, and the parents. And in EdTech, one of the growing trends is for products which allow for direct communications between parents and teachers. What role do you think this sort of golden triangle has to play in saving teachers' time?
Well, yes, the golden triangle being the access to data of those three stakeholders. So the children themselves, and we've talked about the instant feedback that children can see very quickly how they're doing and what they can do to improve. So, and the parents can also see how their children are doing and what they can do to support them. And then finally, the teacher also being able to measure the effectiveness of what they're doing in the classroom. But I think the one point that I'd like to make is that I think it's beholden on all providers to have that kind of transparency about what they're doing. So I think the days again when the classroom was almost a hermetically sealed box is over now, and that the exciting leaps that we can take now in education is by drawing in all those three stakeholders. And data obviously is the route to do that. But as Jim said, is what data and how you display it, and so that teachers, parents, and the students themselves are not being overwhelmed with a lot of data points that are being fed back to them. So it's a combination of the transparency, but also the targeting of the data that is important.
And Leroy, I wanted to turn to you now on the subject. We've looked at teacher workload, but of course there's the question of teacher to well-being. And there's a striking parallel between teachers in China and the UK, in that in both countries, exactly 34% of teachers have reported some kind of anxiety or mental health problem in the last year. What kind of resources do you think we can build and work upon in educational technology to help with teacher well-being?
For so long, the answer has been, well, it's just teaching. It's hard, right? So there's a new assessment, collect data on it, do this, right? So I think what we really need to do, and we now have the technology to do so, is to genuinely ask teachers, how are you feeling? Are we meeting your needs in terms of workload? Are we meeting your needs in terms of helping your students? So we developed a product called Staff Pulse, and it was designed by an organizational psychologist with those needs in mind. So it's a survey that we're sending out to the staff. It's anonymous, so they can provide their feedback, they can make comments, and then you're able to actually look at it across markets as well. So this was done in the UK, so we could look, schools were approaching us and asking why their retention numbers were so low compared to the school down the road. So being able to look at your results and objectively take a look and see maybe we actually aren't taking care of teacher well-being in the way we thought. Hopefully collecting that data for the school and for the head teachers really allows them to have a point where they can start to make teacher well-being an important part of everyday life in the school.
I think that's something that's important to recognize, and is that probably part of the reason why teacher workload is such an issue is obviously a lot of the time because the complicated nature of our school systems. In the UK, as I said, we have the second most complex school system after only Chile. And in China, of course, there's, like many countries, which is entirely normal, a long-reputed distinction between urban and Chinese schools when it comes to their adoption of educational technology. In fact, only 55% of Chinese teachers in the 6 central provinces of China are said to be in favor of adopting educational technology, whereas nearly 90% in urban areas are. Dawn, the question I wanted to ask you was, in overcoming these barriers between schools, is there a way that we can create networks between schools? And also, to what extent should this be school-led or teacher-led?
I think it's really important for it to be teacher-led because teachers understand the areas in which they're working. And we've seen this in the UK with informal networks and the rise of teach meets, which are teachers coming together very often in their own time, perhaps after school, sharing ideas and experiences that have worked for them in their school and talking for short periods of time. And then at Too Simple for CPD, we've sort of have our own what's called MASH meets, where teachers can come together and share experiences of using the software. So the informal networks are growing, and now in the UK, Department of Education have set up demonstrator schools so that schools can learn from each other on the best value and adoption of technology and take what works and put it into their own setting.
Yeah, and I think in China, I think we're seeing a similar process. I think we're, with the Internet Plus Education platform that the Department for Education is developing, we're seeing that kind of trying to create networks between schools. And sort of the concluding questions I wanted to ask, address both to Leroy and Emma, if you can answer in turn, is how can we use online resources to give teacher support, and what kind of continuing professional development options lie out there through educational technology?
I mean, one of the great things about teaching around the world is we're trying to achieve some of the same outcomes in helping our students. And I think a lot of teachers don't need to recreate the wheel. So there are a lot of great forums. On our site, for example, we had people, it was initially mainly UK teachers, and then organically others started coming because they had a question on how to best come up with a math resource, how to best, structure your science lesson. And then we started getting teachers from China, from other parts of Europe, from the States, and it turned into a truly global network of now over 12 million teachers that are on the site exchanging resources. And so empowering them, and then we also have the ability for them to then provide those resources for others. So teachers can become entrepreneurs even in sharing some of their best practices. And I think it genuinely helps in, as I mentioned, just empowering them and having those networks that they can touch on.
Well, I think probably the most important point that I would add is that and I think it brings it back to what are the responsibilities of EdTech providers, and I think the most important thing is that you don't just assume you're selling your product to someone, a teacher, a school, or a school district, but that you have an obligation, a responsibility, if you like, to go in there and to support teachers in the adoption, but also the follow-up, so that you don't do that and then walk away. You build your relationship with the teachers, and also you encourage them to talk to each other. And we've certainly had that experience that teachers are keen to share good practice, they're keen to share their experience, and as an EdTech provider, they're actually our best advocates. So finding ways of supporting teachers is critical if you're building a technology product.
Thank you. And just as a concluding remark, I'd like to say on behalf of the British Educational Suppliers Association, China has announced obviously by 2030 that it wants to move towards educational technology with Chinese characteristics. And in the UK also, we've got our horizons on looking at 2030. But we're delighted to have the opportunity to discuss our mutual collaboration and best practices with Chinese educational technology companies and Chinese schools. And we're always delighted to hold a conversation. So thank you everyone for attending, and I'd like to extend a warm applause to my panelists for their participation today.
本环节到此结束，请有序退场。